Hello, hello. It is that time once again to do some anime reviews. This time, of course, we are looking at Winter 2023 and all the shows I watched. We're going to start, as always, with the stuff I didn't watch and why I didn't watch it. This was actually very well received. I heard a lot of good things about it. I'm interested enough that I'm probably going to read the manga eventually. I don't know if I'll ever get to the show, but I think the adaptation was considered quite good as well. Seemed like a lot of fun, but I don't know. I just didn't get to it. Buddy Daddies, I watched the first episode of. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the premise. It's another entry in this very up and coming genre of mobster types are suddenly put into a very domestic, often child raising situation, and just kind of like the contrast between these two very different sides of their life. How do they learn all these domestic skills? What things are they unexpectedly good at because of their underground expertise? I don't know. It's always a fun story. The animation and stuff seemed good, but again, I just didn't get to it. I watched the first episode of this, Trigun Stampede. I was very interested because I really like Studio Orange, the CG anime studio that was working on it. And I think Orange delivered kind of what I expected from them. Really lively, active choreography, doing all sorts of stuff that would be prohibitively difficult in traditional animation. Just really wacky and over the top. I thought it fit the character of Trigun, of Vash the Stampede, very well. Some of the stuff I didn't like, though, they rearranged a lot of the major plot points, such that kind of the sci-fi-ness of the series and the major villains and different aspects of Vash's character were introduced like right away. And I really didn't like that. I wasn't really sure why they did that. And I was kind of just skeptical of the direction the plot was going in general. So it wasn't enough to convince me, even though, as always, I love Orange's animation style. Tsurune Season 2, I heard nothing but good things about. And as I said in my preview video for this season, which was, 5 months ago now or whatever, I was like, yeah, I think because there's not a whole lot of stuff I want to watch, I should finish watching the first season of Tsurune and then watch the second season of it. That'll be like a great thing to see. Like, I'm sure I'd love it. It's KyoAni. It's a sports series. It seems very like introspective and psychological. All sorts of things I love, but I just didn't get to it. Moe-pan, I watched the first episode of. A judo series, kind of slice of lifey. There was aspects I liked. I liked the characters. I liked kind of the spirit of it. It seemed like you were going to learn a lot about judo. I always like when they're kind of educational. But other aspects of it were like very, very cheap and low budget and kind of how do we get this conveyed in the simplest, fastest way. Not like charmingly cheap in the way that some other low budget shows are, but cheap in a way that I just kind of felt I don't know, exasperated. Like, I couldn't make the effort to watch it if it didn't feel like they were making the effort to make it. The final season of Pokemon, I was quite curious about. It's like a historic event. The story of Ash is finally coming to an end. But when it actually came time to watch it, I realized I don't actually care that much. I watched the show as a kid, sure, because I was a Pokemon fanatic, like every other kid my age. But I stopped watching it fairly quickly, like probably during the Gold and Silver arcs. As a kid, I was so insufferable about it. I thought, like, man, Ash is like a terrible trainer. Like, he's not catching all of these Pokemon he encounters. His team is like pathetic for the amount of progress he's made. He doesn't understand like type weaknesses and stuff. He's not making his Pokemon use their strong moves. I was so like obsessed with the games and to the lesser extent the card games and kind of like the mechanics of Pokemon and stuff. I couldn't really get that caught up in just like the fun story of Pokemon. And nowadays, I still really love Pokemon, but it's almost like reversed where I don't actually play the new games. I kind of follow the competitive scene, and I have kind of maybe some mild interest in playing Showdown, but I probably will never play like Scarlet and Violet. Like, I just don't care. Whereas like the personality and charm and stuff of the Pokemon still really appeal to me, and I love the new Pokemon designs, and I love Pokemon merch and all of that. So I don't know, it's like kind of hard for me to judge what my relationship with Pokemon is, but I know that the TV show is not really a major part of it. Like I haven't watched it since I was a kid. I don't particularly care about Ash as a character. It's like I felt like I ought to care just because it is such a historic moment. It had been going on for so long and now it's ending and all of these famous characters are going away. But it felt like kind of stolen valor for me to try to will some emotional response to it. It's kind of like, when Dragon Ball Super ended, I loved Dragon Ball as a kid. I loved Dragon Ball Z, watching it on YTV. The Dragon Ball manga was one of the first manga I read. I have a very strong personal attachment to that. But does that mean that automatically I should care about Super ending? It's like a totally different thing at this point. Like, I'm in such a different stage of my life. I don't know. I think it's good that I didn't try to force myself to understand this and have an emotional reaction to this or whatever, and I could admit to myself, it just doesn't matter that much. Okay, stuff I did watch. Nothing. I didn't watch anything this season. So that's it. 16 degrees out. Okay. I think all the normies are gone. We can talk about Onimai. Okay, so yes, I did watch one show this season, and it was a pervert show for perverts. Onimai. Onii-chan wa Oshimai. At its core, though, even though I say, oh, it's so perverse, so I have to hide it away, not make it clear that I watched this or I'm talking about this, a lot of how it operates is pretty common anime psychology. The MC is socially inept, he's incapable of existing in society, he's wasted his youth at the start of the show. I think he's like in his early 20s. He's a hardcore otaku. He loves eroge, anime, manga, gaming, whatever you can name. But this miraculous opportunity arises that allows him to go back in time and redo his entire development. And the round two is better for a number of reasons. Like now they're getting fawned over by many cute girls. Their incompetence, which was before debilitating, is now reasonable. You know, they're just a kid. It's to be expected. And it's surmountable. They're now capable of making the choices that get over these crippling anxieties and lack of social awareness and depression and other mental health issues. They're able to meaningfully improve their lives and strive forward. And it's endearing. We find it very sympathetic and endearing and admirable that they have these shortcomings, but they're still giving it their all. The trauma of their past is overwritten by the halcyon days of a new springtime of youth. This is a pretty common thing in anime, if you don't know. There's many shows that have the premise of I was reborn into this scenario. Often it's like another world. It's like an isekai, and yes, all of those fantasy elements are there, but the primary thing is that they get to redo a big chunk of their life. They get to replace their old social life with a new one. They get to replace their old mental health issues with a nice, positive, achieving outlook. So, is the perversion of this show really because of its specific premise? Or is this kind of perverse, avoidant, wishful thinking mentality, is this just baked into popular anime everywhere? In almost every isekai, and so many of these I went back in time and XYZ happened series, in all of these, suddenly I've been given the miracle chance to redo all of my mistakes. Maybe. But it's also very much perverse because of its specific, very perverse premise. This is, after all, because I haven't said it clearly yet, a show about a 20-year-old, 20-ish, I don't know why I guess 20 specifically, pervert, meet otaku man turning into a middle school girl via the magic of his sister's chemical formula medicine thing. Okay, let's get this out of the way first. Is this like a trans thing? Because when the show first came out and when it was being previewed and the premise came out and people kind of first discovered it, a lot of people were actually like praising it as a trans affirmative story. Okay, I saw this in a few Twitter threads that were basically like, this is actually a pretty inspiring show because it's all about someone who gets their life together after transitioning, after becoming a more suitable to them gender, and suddenly things make sense and they can achieve so much more and they have a social life and they're happy. And then after the show actually came out and people started actually watching it, this narrative was abandoned. Nobody was pushing this reading of it anymore. But, you know, okay, yeah, like, I think this is actually a happy story about someone becoming a girl. I think it is actually very trans-affirming in that sense. They become a girl, they embrace becoming a girl, you know, they adopt this lifestyle and they learn what that means and they make all sorts of changes and adjustments based on it. Their life drastically improves. It opens up in all these new avenues. They get way happier. And of course, in real life, it's nowhere near this magical or idyllic. You're not going to be drugged with some magic potion that just instant presto changes you. But this is what happens to trans people when they transition. In like 99% of cases. You find that your life improves in a whole lot of ways. You get way happier. You feel enriched in all sorts of things that you felt like you were missing out on before. I think it would be very disrespectful if this was the only trans media we got, where these like super easy paths of just overnight magical change. I think, of course, it's important to present stories that show the hardships and the challenges and the struggles and the fact that you're going to be ostracized or much, much worse by various groups of people. That there's people that will just start hating you for no reason and accusing you of all sorts of things simply because you're trans. It's important to acknowledge those realities in some stories, but I think it's also good to have stories where it is so unilaterally positive to just go for it. I think it's encouraging. I think trans people need to realize that, yes, this really will improve your lives in so many ways. It'll come with new hardships too, but there's a reason people do it. And there's a reason why surveys show that people who transition are so overwhelmingly happy with the choice they made. It's embarrassing to admit this because it's silly and it feels kind of superficial or overly naive or, objectifying or whatever. But I'll admit it, when I was starting to question gender stuff and thinking about transitioning, something that motivated me a lot is that in slice of life shows that are usually about girls just having friendships and having little adventures and, doing all these like very low-key attainable things, and yet they lived in such this like warm golden happiness. They were so content. They were so at peace with themselves. Looking at that and seeing that happiness that I had never experienced and kind of associating that in my mind with these are all girl characters, that did help me transition. That did help me articulate some of the things that I felt were missing in my own life, things that I felt uncomfortable with, things that I felt dysphoric about. And this show, is very different than those shows in a great number of ways. But I think it could help other people too. Like, I think it could spark that idea in their head that could end up being life-changingly helpful. Of course, it would be even more helpful if there were shows like this that weren't pervert shows for perverts. And, maybe there are some out there, but this one is definitely a pervert show for perverts. But, alas, we take what we can get. So is it problematic that in this show transness is conflated with perversion? That we have the character who transitions, he is a massive pervert and has all these fetishes, and that's so much of the post-transition lifestyle, including the appearance of the main character themselves, is presented through such a perverse lens that there's so many scenes where she's like excited to be able to ogle other girls or have these fetishy experiences with other girls because now she is a girl, or like the weird fetishy stuff with her own body and all the fetishy situations she gets trapped in, that all result from her having transitioned. Is that problematic? Does that undermine this positive trans message? Well, yes. Absolutely yes. I think in many ways this is like the demonic perverseness of trans people that all sorts of conservative, chuddy people, transphobic people, and TERFs project onto trans people and assume that all trans people are harboring these perverse fetishy thoughts and stuff. This is a narrative that would validate all of that if such people were aware it existed, which unfortunately I don't think anybody is in that Venn diagram overlap. At the same time, though, this is not the most problematic of the part of the show by any stretch. The trans factor is not what makes the show a pervert show for perverts. Maybe you could argue that the logistics of the plot could kind of conflate the two things or create some causality between the two things, but what we're going to explore is that there are no logistics to the plot. So it is very, very fanservice-y and fetishy. It's the most fetishy and fanservice-y show I've watched in quite a few years now. So people with body types that range from ridiculously exaggerated and overproportioned all the way to the other extreme, which may or may not be illegal depending on where you live, get naked very many times and for long durations, and you get all sorts of very up close, no bones about it, no obstruction angles of all of this. All sorts of fetishy situations emerge from very flimsy premises. For almost no reason at all, suddenly you're launched into some very intense fetishy scenario. I'm not going to list these out. There's no need. There's a deep, intense focus on the sensory experience, on the pleasures of these fetishy situations, of how people's body feel, of how they're achieving these different pleasures and stuff. Both through the characters like describing it, the inner monologue of the characters describing the sensations that are happening to them, and then also in the production and the animation, they really go out of their way to bring out a lot of like movement and sakuga to these depictions so that you can really viscerally know what it would feel like to be in that spot. The plot itself is kind of oriented around fan service. All of the major climactic moments of many different sequences are really just building up to the most extreme fan service in that kind of mode or genre or fetish. And this is very different than Maid Dragon or Wataten, which are, somewhat problematic shows that I've talked about before, that I've really praised at length before. And they do overlap, they have maybe something you could call a fan service scene. They have certainly fetishes expressed through the characters and the characters' fetishes and the situations. Excuse me, I'm really gassy. But these are more in service of like a gag or to kind of highlight a different character aspect or something, rather than really just purely being for generating fantasies and masturbation, right? The intent is like really clearly different, I think, when you look at the implementation. Whereas in Maid Dragon or Wataten, there may be some, semi-explicit scene or something revealing or whatever. It's like super brief. It's more just like to set up the gag of someone reacting to that, or as the punchline to a gag where that situation emerged through some weird contraption. Whereas here, the focus is just getting to that scene and like extending it as long as possible. Tellingly, and this is definitely not true for Wataten or Maid Dragon, there is an uncensored version of Onimai. The fact that they had to do that, that they A, had to censor it, and then B, there was demand for the uncensored version, I think is very telling to this difference in intent. But more than just the fact that there's a lot of fan service, that the series is kind of saturated with it, and that the fan service is like very intense and visceral, what I think really separates the show from other shows like Maid Dragon or Wataten is the logic behind it. And this is the world of Doujin Logic. And we're gonna explore this more. So, I first kind of came up with this term when Maid Dragon Season 2 was airing. There is an episode where Kobayashi magically gets a penis. It's the scheming and pranks of Iruru. And she starts coming on to all the other dragon girls. It's a very stupid, silly episode. But people kind of took it seriously and really tried to point out what was problematic about it, of which there are many things. The messaging is very weird, and it's pretty atypical of the rest of the series, or at least the rest of the anime series. It really conflicts with a lot of other values of the series about relationships and about attraction, about personalities and what makes you you. So a lot of people on Twitter were like pretty upset about this. I saw a couple threads like complaining about it from, I think, pretty reasonable places. Like they were rightfully disappointed that the show went in this direction, having not read the manga and certainly having not read other works by Cool Kyoshinsha. But I felt like I understood the answer to this. I felt like I understood what was really motivating this stupid penis plotline, which is that the Doujinshi Logic of Cool Kyoshinsha, who writes a lot of very, very fetishy, very explicit doujinshi, alongside writing much more tame, reasonable series like Maid Dragon, it just kind of, the scales like tipped a little bit, and that Doujinshi Logic sort of unleashed itself on Maid Dragon a little bit more. And I think it's like in the manga of Main Dragon, it's much more common that things kind of operate based on this logic, and there's all of these really weird fetishy diversions and stuff, and that the whole messaging of it gets pretty muddled by it. But KyoAni, I think, to their credit, did an amazing job of kind of aligning this stuff in a way that was way more broadly appealing and made the show, I think, a lot better than the manga. But at any rate, I think the Doujin logic itself is just like a factor that most normal audiences just like fail to consider. So what is it exactly? You can kind of think about it as the gap between a typical series, you know, any series you can think of, and then a porn doujinshi of that series. What changes, not just in terms of the content, which of course gets a lot more explicit, but in the logic of the world of the series, that gap is what I'm referring to here as Doujin logic. So characters' relationships warp, but they don't totally break. They're not like totally different. They've just changed enough to become these like hyper horny versions of themselves. Sexual opportunity lurks around literally any corner. Anything can just suddenly happen at any time for any reason. Previously innocuous character aspects, things that might just appear to be like cute or quirky as elements of the character design, are zoomed in on with this hyper fetishizing eye to bring out an entirely new aspect of them. Consequences and causality are thrown out the window. Nobody really is motivated by any sensible, long-term, consistent rationality, but instead everyone's motives are like purely erotic and kind of random and nonsensical. So Onimai is a series that exists only in kind of the doujin of itself. It already starts in this layer without a series that it branched off of, that it mutated from. The magical gender swap, the plethora of fetishy escalation, the convenient explanation away of all the weird logical inconsistencies and stuff, all of this is kind of smoothed over to operate only in this like doujin mode. Only the final step, if you know what I mean, is missing. But it's hardly necessary, because you get all of the setups of these doujinshi type situations. You get all of the flimsy premises and the rapid escalation. You can fill in that last gap with your imagination, like trivially. It encourages you to do so. And it's from this logic, from a world that operates entirely within this mode, that has it as its like fundamental storytelling premises, and has it as like the major causal driver, as nonsensical as it is. From that foundation emerges this really like low-key, idyllic, slice of life fun where the characters are like satisfied and social and happy. And it's like, this is what's like really interesting to me, is it's this conflation. It's the fact that it's kind of swapped, that before you might have a slice of life series that has erotic doujinshi about it, but this is like an erotic doujinshi that has a slice of life series about it. It's weird. Okay, so why do I know all this stuff? Well, I'll admit it. I was a doujinshi addict. I had a period of time where I regularly trolled through certain unhappy, endangered bear sites, if you catch my drift, looking for new content in a wide variety of genres that I won't get into. Beyond that, I also regularly read through the comments on that site. I discussed doujinshi on 4chan and in certain discords. I really felt like I was part of a community of fellow perverts who were really into this stuff, and we talked a lot about what we liked and what we didn't like, what artists we liked, what kind of developments we liked, what kind of genres we would like to see emerge, things like that. And what you find out very quickly and very unsurprisingly in such a community, these doujin addicts are depressed. There was very few people that seemed like they were in like a good time in their life, that everything was turning up well for them. Instead, they had the free time and the depravity and the lack of competing priorities to devote themselves to this stuff, and their lifestyles reflected that. And myself, I was in a dark, frustrated, confused, and lonely time in my life when I was most addicted. In fact, I would say the two things were very intensely correlated. That the more I dove into this stuff, it was because I had so much less going on in my life. And you could say, oh, it's probably bidirectional, the causality, like getting addicted to these sorts of things makes you more socially inept and removes your opportunities to do other things. But I don't know. I think for me personally, at least, it was very much like the direction of if I was lacking other fulfillment, I turned to this rather than turning to this removed fulfillment from my life. But it probably varies from person to person. The important part is that those two things are generally in lockstep for a lot of people. And a lot of the people I saw in these comments, in these threads, in my discussions with them were having the same issues, the same losses, and most importantly, the same desires. Because Doujinshi Logic, I think, is more than just masturbatory. It's more than just fetishy. It's a transcendental escape from the mundanity of life. Because bad depression, it often feels like the very forces of reality are stacked against you. It's not just like you need some sort of change in your life. You need to live somewhere else or be with different people or have a different job or this or that. There's no set of changes that could be made. There's no other situation you could put yourself in that would solve your depression, that would make you feel better. It is just life itself. And Doujin Logic offers not just the possibility of the pleasures depicted within. It's not just that you're fantasizing about having that particular experience, as good as that might look like it feels, but there's this sense of you could just escape all rationality. You could escape this causal chain that has defined your entire life right now. You could escape the psychological constraints that put you kind of at odds with the rest of the world. The very human condition gets morphed in this world of doujinshi, such that you could escape the psychological constraints that seem so impossible and overwhelming. And this isn't like some Saturn paradise, like heaven or whatever, where you would kind of lose any sense of being yourself in the first place. But instead, it's this cacophonic slurry of sensory overload, where your current desires rip you away from everything you currently know. Where you're so entrenched in depression, in inadequacy, in self-esteem issues, and whatever, you can't get your life going, but you have this thread of desire that connects you to something so overwhelmingly different. And doujinshis offer this fantasy of being like ripped out of the ocean of current life. And maybe you die, maybe that's it, but you're out of there for once. Don't worry about me though. That sounded, very depressing and heavy. And it was, but emphasis on was and not is. I'm on the other side of this now. My life has changed a lot since my doujinshi addiction era, including, of course, transitioning, including, hormonal therapy and presenting as a woman and having a social life as a woman and all of that. And looking back on it now, I can understand that a lot of the things that felt like really fundamental, innate to reality barriers between me and my life, I understand that now that was gender dysphoria in a lot of cases. And likewise, a lot of the things that really appealed to me about doujinshi, about specific genres, specific fetishes and stuff, I understand now, I can see now, we're very clearly, in retrospect, like very extreme escapes from other things about my body that I felt dysphoric about, other complexes I had, other things that like really haunted me and antagonized me. These fetishes were like kind of like a hyper parody that pushed all the way past it. And I think that was why it had so much appeal. So now it's been years and years since I sought out stuff like this. I'm fulfilled, I'm happy, things are good. And in some sense, this arc kind of reflects the arc that our main character in Onimai goes through, right? Because it starts that our otaku MC is super addicted to eroge, but as the series goes on, it's not like explicitly stated, oh, they're quitting eroge. They do continue a lot of other otaku activities. They still like game and read manga and stuff, but it seems to me that like that kind of masturbatory aspect of their life, that life where they were kind of addicted to this doujinshi logic, was replaced with IRL experiences. And granted, these IRL experiences still follow Doujin logic. They still emerge in our MC's life as a result of this weird, irrational doujinshi thinking. But it's still like an improvement. Like, as the messaging of the series, it's still definitely seen as an improvement and like an escape from something. So really, it's kind of like not so much that they've escaped Doujin logic, but they've achieved the dream of all doujinshi logics, or all doujinshi addicts, that the doujinshi logic has superseded their reality. They've done it. They've made the doujinshi life real. And they've done so, though, by learning life skills, by going back to school, by making friends, by becoming like a more reasonable, grounded person. So then it just gets very confusing. Like, what is actually the messaging of the series? And of course, you know, this was motivated by the gender switch, that they had to do all this stuff. But in a certain sense, the messaging is like, oh, this should be even easier if you're like just a cis otaku. Why can't you achieve these things yourself then? Just because you don't have this excuse that like forces you to do it. I don't know. In some senses, it's like very encouraging, but it's like encouraging you to do something that's impossible. But at the same time, the steps to achieving that impossible thing are actually reasonable things that you ought to do, and they probably will improve your life. The messaging in the series is so strange. And we shouldn't be surprised that it is, because the whole series operates on doujinshi logic. It doesn't operate on the logic and rationality of the real world. Okay, so why did I watch this? Because, you know, the reason that most people watch it doesn't really apply to me. Psychologically, I think it's pretty fascinating. I spent, you know, just 5 or 6 slides just now talking about the psychology for like 25 minutes or so. So obviously I thought something strange was going on, and I wanted to really investigate it. Because it does a lot. It reinforces, transcends, and encourages escaping the doujinshi addiction mentality, using the Doujin logic. It's pretty unique. It's an unprecedented level, I think, of infolding that logic in on itself in a scenario where someone who's like addicted to that logic is now living a life dictated by it. And I can't really parse it. Typically I can kind of think of anime on axes of problematicness and helpfulness, where even if something is very problematic, it can still be very psychologically helpful to some of the otaku watching it, because it really meets them where they are and still can deliver some very encouraging messaging and stuff. But like this one, I don't know where it falls when trying to score it on these metrics. I think those are like the wrong questions to ask about it now. It's so weird. I also was just kind of curious, like what would my reaction be to a fanservice show like this? Because as I said, I haven't watched anything like this in years. I do not seek out material like this anymore. It does not do anything for me. I've become so much more like vanilla, I guess. So I was kind of curious, like what's going to happen if I watch this? I didn't know, have I been like resensitized to the depravity of these things? Would I see it through like normie eyes and be like, wow, this is disgusting, this is so problematic? But no, nothing felt at all like erotic or appealing to me. It certainly didn't connect with me or appeal to me on that axis. But I never felt shocked or appalled or anything either. I was just kind of like, oh, they're going with this. Oh, they're doing this scenario. Oh, of course they would include that fetish or whatever. I was able to still see it like academically, with this sort of academic appreciation of it, even if it wasn't like viscerally connecting. So this is kind of cool. It kind of feels like I've permanently unlocked this genre. And even though I probably won't ever get like the full appeal of it again, these are shows that like most people can't watch. Most people are going to get grossed out by. and I can sit through them just fine and still get something out of it and still find it interesting. By far, though, the main reason I was interested in watching this and kept watching it is because it had really, really great production. Really great and really unique. I actually cannot get over how good the production was for this. I could praise it for another 10 slides if I wanted to, but I'll try to summarize it really briefly. The character animation was so lively and fluid and expressive. The series actually goes on a pretty wide emotional spectrum, from really sincere sentimental moments to all the flustered perversion stuff to the really traditional slice of life, innocent fun stuff. And all of it I thought was reflected really, really well in the animation. The backgrounds I thought were great too. They felt really lived in and detailed and kind of rich with authenticity. But at the same time, they had that kind of Shaft feel from like Hidamari's sketch, where they're sort of like iconified and simplified in some ways, and they often had like a filter of like stars overlaid on top of it that gave everything this kind of like really dreamy, floaty vibe that I loved. And the way that fan service is depicted, even though it didn't really do much for me, even though it kind of just bounced off me, it was so expert. They understood so well what you ought to convey to give people that intense sensory, visceral experience. They understood so well like what to focus on and how to animate it so fluidly and stuff. And I don't want to give examples because it'll sound like a pervert, but quite a few times I was like, wow, that's impressive. They definitely spent like 100 hours on that really fetishy shot. So anyways, I don't know how to score this really, because as I said, most of the dimensions that it's supposed to be appealing on didn't really hit for me. So in my eyes, it was in some ways kind of just like a pretty decent slice of life show with some funny premises and moments that was spread out with a whole lot of fan service scenes that didn't really do much for me. But at the same time, I did really appreciate how well done those fan service scenes are, even though I didn't really like enjoy them properly. But on another sense, it's like this whole psychological aspect. Is it helpful? Is it affirming? Would I have found this powerful and influential if I was still in the phase of like kind of figuring out gender stuff? And those questions are like really difficult to answer. Like I just spent 6 slides like kind of talking around them, but never really getting anywhere. So it was like kind of a fascinating show in that level too. But at the same time, like not really super compelling. Like I wasn't always locked into it or whatever. But it was good enough that I watched it in a season where I didn't really watch anything else at all, and I was very busy. I don't know. We'll give it an 8. I think that's a fair score, all things considered. Like I think it was really good, and I did have fun watching it. But I can't put it any higher because it really is not what I like anymore. Oh, okay, that's it. Join me next season where I'm definitely going to watch some actual more shows than this. Okay, bye-bye.